Hey everyone, tonight we're exploring one of history's most extraordinary transformations, the journey of a man who went from palace prince to desert fugitive to the deliverer of an entire nation. We're diving into the life of Moses, whose story reads like the ultimate underdog tale, a Hebrew baby sentenced to death who became an Egyptian prince, a privileged ruler who threw away everything for justice, and a reluctant shepherd who would challenge the greatest empire on earth, armed with nothing but a wooden staff and divine authority. This is the story of how a stuttering exile became the lawgiver whose words still echo through civilization 3.5 millennia later, and how the most unlikely leader in history learned that true power comes not from human strength, but from surrender to purposes greater than ourselves. So without further ado, let's begin. In the shadow of the Great Pyramids that towered over the Nile Delta like monuments to human ambition and divine pretension, a Hebrew infant drew his first breath in circumstances that would have marked him for death before his third day of life. The year was approximately 1526 BC, and the Kingdom of Egypt had reached the zenith of its power under a dynasty of pharaohs who ruled the known world with authority that seemed as permanent as the granite colossi that bore their names and as absolute as the flooding of the Nile that sustained their civilization. Yet beneath the magnificent facade of Egyptian prosperity lay currents of fear and demographic anxiety that would shape the destiny of nations and transform an abandoned baby into the most significant leader in human history. The descendants of Jacob, who had entered Egypt 4 centuries earlier as 70 souls seeking refuge from famine, had multiplied into a population that now numbered in the hundreds of thousands, their fertility and industry creating both economic benefit and political concern for the Egyptian authorities who governed them. The new pharaoh who had arisen over Egypt, tradition identifies him as Seti I, though the historical record remains deliberately obscured by Egyptian reluctance to document their most humiliating defeat, possessed neither knowledge of nor gratitude for the Hebrew administrator whose wisdom had preserved Egyptian civilization during the 7 years of famine that had devastated the ancient Near East. The prosperity that Joseph's policies had secured for Egypt had become, in the minds of subsequent rulers, evidence of Egyptian superiority rather than Hebrew service. Come, let us deal wisely with them, lest they multiply, and it happen, in the event of war, that they also join our enemies and fight against us, and so go up out of the land, the pharaoh counselled his advisers, his words revealing both the strategic thinking that had made Egypt the dominant power of the ancient world and the paranoid fear that would ultimately lead to its humiliation at the hands of the very people he sought to control. The wisdom that Egypt employed to address the Hebrew population growth involved policies that transformed willing immigrants into unwilling slaves, prosperous communities into labour camps, and a people who had served Egyptian interests into a population whose elimination was considered essential for Egyptian security. The building projects that required Hebrew labour, the treasure cities of Pithom and Ramses, were designed to glorify Pharaoh's name while breaking the spirit of those who constructed them. Yet the harshest oppression failed to achieve its intended demographic effect, as Hebrew fertility seemed to increase in direct proportion to the severity of Egyptian persecution. The midwives who attended Hebrew births reported that these women gave birth with ease and vigour that defied Egyptian expectations and frustrated Egyptian intentions. The more the Egyptians afflicted them, the more they multiplied and grew, creating a paradox that challenged Egyptian confidence in their ability to control the forces they had set in motion. It was in this context of escalating oppression and frustrated policy that Pharaoh issued the decree that would inadvertently create the circumstances for his own downfall. Every son who is born you shall cast into the river, and every daughter you shall save alive. The Nile, which had been Egypt's source of life and prosperity for thousands of years, would become an instrument of genocide designed to eliminate the future leadership of the Hebrew people. The Hebrew woman who would become Moses' mother, Jochebed, daughter of Levi and descendant of the patriarch whose zealous defense of family honor had once terrorized an entire city, faced a choice that no mother should ever be forced to make. The child she had born was not merely healthy and normal, but possessed qualities that marked him as extraordinary, even by the standards of a people known for producing remarkable individuals in times of crisis. The text records that she saw that he was beautiful, but the Hebrew word translated beautiful carried connotations that extended beyond physical appearance to encompass spiritual significance and divine favour. This was not mere maternal pride, but recognition that this child was marked for purposes that transcended the immediate circumstances of his birth. The same intuition that had led Hebrew mothers throughout their history to preserve and protect the children through whom God would work was operating in Jochebed's assessment of her son. For 3 months she managed to conceal the child's existence through methods that required both practical ingenuity and providential assistance. The hiding places she devised, the timing of his feedings, the coordination with family members and neighbours who risked their own lives to maintain the conspiracy of silence, all demonstrated the desperation of a people who understood that their survival depended upon their ability to outwit the most sophisticated surveillance system in the ancient world. Yet even the most careful concealment could not be maintained indefinitely against the systematic searches that Egyptian authorities conducted throughout Hebrew settlements. The decision to place the child in a waterproof basket and float him on the Nile represented both ultimate desperation and extraordinary faith. Desperation because it required abandoning him to forces beyond human control, and faith because it trusted that the God who had preserved their people through 4 centuries of Egyptian residence might yet provide deliverance through means that human wisdom could not anticipate. The papyrus basket that Jochebed wove and the pitch and asphalt with which she waterproofed it were the same materials that Egyptian boat builders used for vessels designed to navigate the treacherous currents and crocodile-infested waters of the Nile. Her craftsmanship reflected both maternal love and practical skill, creating a miniature ark that would preserve not merely one child's life, but the hope of an entire nation's freedom. The location where she placed the basket, among the reeds at the river's edge where Pharaoh's daughter was known to bathe, revealed strategic thinking that complemented her maternal instincts. This was not random abandonment, but calculated placement designed to maximize the possibility that the child would be discovered by someone with both the authority and the inclination to preserve his life, rather than enforce Pharaoh's murderous decree. The presence of Miriam, Moses' sister, who watched from a distance to observe the outcome of her mother's desperate plan, demonstrated the family solidarity that had enabled Hebrew survival through centuries of foreign domination, while providing the human link that would reconnect the preserved child with his origins when circumstances permitted such reconnection. The arrival of Pharaoh's daughter at her customary bathing place occurred with timing that could only be attributed to providential coordination of human routines and divine purposes. The princess who discovered the crying infant was moved by compassion that transcended political considerations, while possessing the social position necessary to protect a Hebrew child, despite her father's policies designed to eliminate such children. "This is one of the Hebrews' children," she observed, her words demonstrating both intellectual recognition of the child's ethnic identity and emotional response to his immediate need. The decision she made to preserve his life rather than enforce her father's decree revealed character qualities that qualified her to serve unwittingly as an instrument of divine purposes that would ultimately challenge the very foundation of Egyptian power. The intervention of Miriam, who approached the princess with the seemingly innocent suggestion that she find a Hebrew nurse for the child, completed the providential chain of events that restored Moses to his biological mother while ensuring his legal protection as an adopted member of the royal family. The irony that Jochebed would be paid by Pharaoh's treasury to nurse her own son captured perfectly the way divine wisdom could transform human evil into instruments of divine purpose. The name that Pharaoh's daughter gave to the child, Moses, meaning drawn out, reflected her understanding of the circumstances of his rescue, while prophetically describing his future role as one who would draw an entire nation out of Egyptian bondage. The princess who named him could not have imagined that she was preparing the instrument of her own father's humiliation and her kingdom's greatest defeat. The dual identity that Moses would develop during his formative years, Hebrew by birth and ethnicity, Egyptian by legal status and education, would provide him with unique qualifications for the role he would eventually play in Hebrew liberation. His access to Egyptian learning, military training, and administrative experience would equip him to confront Pharaoh as an equal rather than as a suppliant, while his knowledge of Hebrew heritage and Egyptian oppression would motivate him to risk everything for the sake of justice and freedom. The education that Moses received in Pharaoh's court exposed him to the highest levels of Egyptian wisdom, which encompassed not merely practical skills, but the accumulated knowledge of the most advanced civilization in the ancient world. Egyptian mathematics, astronomy, medicine, architecture, and statecraft represented the pinnacle of human achievement, and Moses' immersion in these disciplines would provide him with intellectual resources that would prove essential for leading a nation and organizing a civilization. Yet his Egyptian education also exposed him to the religious and philosophical assumptions that undergirded Egyptian civilization and justified Egyptian domination over surrounding peoples. The divine pretensions of Egyptian pharaohs, the polytheistic worldview that divided reality among competing deities, the materialistic values that measured worth by earthly possessions and position, all would be challenged by the monotheistic faith that Moses would eventually embrace and proclaim. The tension between Moses' Egyptian upbringing and Hebrew heritage would remain largely beneath the surface during his youth, as the privileges of royal adoption provided insulation from the harsh realities that shaped the daily experience of his kinsmen in the labor camps of Goshen. Yet the knowledge of his true identity, carefully preserved by his biological family and gradually revealed through their continued contact with him, would create an internal conflict that would eventually force him to choose between Egyptian privilege and Hebrew solidarity. The moment of crisis that would transform Moses from Egyptian prince into Hebrew fugitive was approaching with the inexorable force of divine timing, though neither he nor those around him could anticipate the events that would shatter his comfortable existence and launch him on the journey that would culminate in the liberation of a nation and the establishment of a civilization based upon divine law rather than human ambition. The transition from youth to manhood that Moses experienced within the opulent confines of Pharaoh's palace was marked by growing awareness of the contradictions that defined his existence. Hebrew, by blood, yet Egyptian by adoption, heir to privilege built upon the oppression of his own people, beneficiary of an educational system designed to perpetuate the very injustices that his conscience increasingly could not ignore. By his 40th year, Moses had become a figure of considerable importance within the Egyptian power structure, his intelligence and administrative abilities earning him responsibilities that provided intimate knowledge of the mechanisms through which Egyptian authority was exercised and maintained. The military training that had prepared him for leadership roles within the imperial hierarchy had also equipped him with strategic thinking and organizational skills that would prove essential for the challenges that lay ahead, though he remained unaware of the purposes for which these abilities were being developed. The access to Egyptian archives and administrative records that his position provided had given Moses comprehensive understanding of the economic and political relationships that sustained Egyptian dominance over the ancient Near East, including the detailed documentation of Hebrew population, productivity, and potential threat assessment that had motivated Pharaoh's oppressive policies. This inside knowledge of Egyptian concerns and capabilities would prove invaluable when he eventually confronted the empire as an adversary rather than a servant. Yet it was not intellectual understanding, but emotional confrontation with injustice that would ultimately force Moses to choose between the comfort of Egyptian privilege and the demands of Hebrew solidarity. The crisis that shattered his comfortable existence occurred during one of his inspection tours through the Hebrew labor camps, where his administrative responsibilities required him to observe the effectiveness of the forced labor system that his own position helped to maintain. The sight that would change the course of history was both commonplace and unacceptable, an Egyptian taskmaster brutally beating a Hebrew slave whose only crime was the exhaustion that resulted from the inhuman demands placed upon the construction crews. The violence was not exceptional. Such beatings occurred daily throughout the labor camps and were considered necessary components of the management system that extracted maximum productivity from an unwilling workforce. What made this particular incident extraordinary was not its severity but its observer, as Moses found himself confronting the human cost of the system from which he had benefited while recognizing his own kinsman in the victim whose suffering demanded response. The internal conflict that had been building throughout his adult years suddenly crystallized into a moment of moral clarity that would determine not only his personal destiny, but the future of his people. The decision that Moses made was instantaneous and irreversible. So he looked this way and that way, and when he saw no one, he killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. The careful reconnaissance that preceded his action revealed both the practical caution that his Egyptian training had instilled and the moral conviction that his Hebrew heritage had awakened. This was not impulsive violence, but calculated intervention, designed to protect the innocent while eliminating the immediate threat. Yet the attempt to conceal his action by burying the Egyptian's body demonstrated Moses' incomplete understanding of the visibility that surrounded his every move and the surveillance system that monitored the activities of even the most privileged members of Egyptian society. The prince who could command armies and administer provinces had failed to recognize that authority also brought scrutiny, and that his intervention on behalf of Hebrew victims would not go unnoticed by those whose interests such intervention threatened. The confrontation that occurred the following day, when Moses attempted to mediate a dispute between two Hebrew laborers, revealed both the complexity of the situation he had entered and the inadequacy of his approach to addressing it. The question that one of the disputants posed, "Who made you a prince and a judge over us? Do you intend to kill me as you killed the Egyptian?" exposed the futility of his assumption that Hebrew gratitude would automatically follow from his intervention on their behalf. The rejection that Moses experienced from his own people was more devastating than any Egyptian persecution could have been, as it challenged his fundamental assumptions about identity, loyalty, and leadership, while revealing the deep suspicion that decades of oppression had created among those who had learned to view any offer of help as potentially dangerous deception. The very people he sought to serve refused to acknowledge his authority to serve them, leaving him without foundation in either Egyptian or Hebrew society. The discovery that his action had become public knowledge transformed Moses from powerful insider to hunted fugitive within hours, as Pharaoh's response to the killing of an Egyptian by a Hebrew, even a Hebrew prince, could only be execution designed to demonstrate that Egyptian authority would not be challenged regardless of the challenger's previous status or relationship to the royal family. The flight from Egypt that followed was not strategic retreat designed to regroup for future action, but desperate escape that abandoned everything Moses had known and achieved during his 40 years of privileged existence. The prince who had commanded respect throughout the most powerful empire in the ancient world became a nameless wanderer whose survival depended upon his ability to navigate territories where Egyptian authority provided no protection, and where his only resources were the skills he had acquired and the providence that had preserved him since infancy. The journey eastward across the Sinai Peninsula took Moses through landscapes that would become intimately familiar during the decades ahead, though he could not have imagined that he was traversing the route that would eventually carry the entire Hebrew nation from slavery to freedom. The harsh terrain that challenged his survival as a solitary fugitive would later test the endurance of millions who followed him toward the land that God had promised to their ancestors. The Well of Midian, where Moses' flight finally ended, was more than a geographical destination. It was a place where divine providence would provide the relationships and experiences necessary to complete his preparation for the role he would eventually play in Hebrew liberation. The encounter with the daughters of Jethro that occurred at this well would transform the fugitive prince into a shepherd whose 40 years in the wilderness would teach him lessons that no Egyptian education could have provided. The rescue of Jethro's daughters from the shepherds who sought to prevent them from watering their flocks demonstrated that Moses' commitment to justice had survived his disillusionment with both Egyptian and Hebrew society. The same moral conviction that had led him to kill the Egyptian taskmaster now motivated him to protect Midianite women, whose only connection to him was their immediate need for assistance against overwhelming opposition. The hospitality that Jethro extended to the stranger who had helped his daughters reflected the desert customs that valued protection of travelers while revealing the character of the man who would become Moses' father-in-law, mentor, and advisor during the crucial early stages of his leadership development. The wisdom that this Midianite priest possessed would complement and sometimes correct the administrative expertise that Moses had acquired in Egyptian service. The marriage to Zipporah that followed Moses' integration into Jethro's household represented more than personal happiness. It marked his complete transition from Egyptian privilege to nomadic simplicity, from urban sophistication to pastoral responsibility, from theoretical knowledge to practical experience of the challenges involved in leading and protecting vulnerable populations in hostile environments. The birth of his son Gershom, whose name meant stranger, reflected Moses' understanding of his own condition as one who belonged fully to neither the Egyptian world he had abandoned nor the Hebrew community that had rejected his intervention. The 40 years he would spend in Midianite exile would gradually transform this sense of alienation into appreciation for the divine purposes that had been operating through circumstances that seemed to contradict every reasonable expectation about leadership development. The flocks that Moses tended during his years as Jethro's son-in-law provided practical education in the challenges of managing large populations of vulnerable creatures in environments where survival depended upon finding adequate water and pasture, while avoiding predators and natural hazards. The skills he developed as a shepherd — patience, vigilance, knowledge of terrain, ability to anticipate and respond to crises — would prove directly applicable to the challenges of leading the Hebrew nation through the wilderness toward their promised inheritance. The solitude that characterized much of Moses' work as a shepherd created opportunities for reflection and spiritual development that would have been impossible within the busy environment of Pharaoh's court. The silence of the desert, broken only by the sounds of wind and wildlife, provided context for the kind of deep thinking and meditation that prepared his mind to receive divine revelation when the time came for his calling to be revealed. The geographical knowledge that Moses acquired during his wanderings through the Sinai Peninsula would prove invaluable when he later led the Hebrew Exodus, as his familiarity with water sources, mountain passes, and tribal territories would enable navigation through landscapes that would have proven impossible for leaders without such preparation. Every valley he explored and every peak he climbed during his exile was adding to the reservoir of practical knowledge that would be essential for his future responsibilities. The political relationships that Moses developed with the various tribal groups that inhabited the region around Midian provided him with diplomatic experience that complemented his administrative training while teaching him to work with peoples whose customs and interests differed significantly from both Egyptian and Hebrew traditions. These relationships would prove crucial when the Hebrew Exodus required safe passage through territories controlled by descendants of Abraham who remembered ancient kinship ties. The religious instruction that Moses received from Jethro introduced him to traditions that preserved knowledge of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob among peoples who had maintained their independence from Egyptian influence, while retaining memory of the divine promises that had been given to the Hebrew patriarchs. This exposure to authentic monotheistic faith would prepare Moses to understand and respond to the divine revelation that would transform him from fugitive shepherd into the deliverer of a nation. Yet throughout these years of preparation, Moses remained unaware of the divine purposes that were being worked out through his exile and the events that were simultaneously unfolding in Egypt. The oppression of the Hebrew people had intensified rather than diminished during his absence, as new pharaohs had adopted even harsher policies designed to break Hebrew resistance and eliminate Hebrew identity through systematic persecution that pushed the limits of human endurance. The cry that arose from Hebrew labor camps during these years of intensified oppression finally reached the ears of the God who had heard the cry of Abel's blood, who had seen the wickedness that preceded the flood, who had observed the pride that built the Tower of Babel. The covenant that he had made with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob was about to be fulfilled through means that would demonstrate his power to the entire ancient world while providing deliverance for the people he had chosen to be his special possession among all the nations of the earth. The ordinary morning that would transform Moses from obscure shepherd into the most significant leader in human history began like countless others during his 4 decades of exile in the wilderness of Midian. The flocks that he tended for his father-in-law Jethro required constant attention in a landscape where survival depended upon finding adequate pasture and water, while avoiding the predators and hazards that threatened vulnerable animals in the harsh environment of the Sinai Peninsula. Yet on this particular day, Moses had led the flock to the far western side of the wilderness, near the mountain that the local inhabitants called Horeb, the mountain of God, whose imposing presence had served as a landmark for desert travelers since time immemorial. The solitude that characterized this remote location had made it a place where Moses often came when he needed respite from the complexities of managing both livestock and the human relationships that governed nomadic life. The sight that arrested his attention and changed the course of human history appeared ordinary at first glance. A bush burning on the mountainside, its flames visible from a considerable distance, yet seemingly neither consuming the vegetation nor spreading to the surrounding landscape. Fire was common in the desert, where the intense heat of the sun could ignite dry vegetation, and where lightning strikes during rare thunderstorms could create blazes that burned until rain or lack of fuel extinguished them. What made this fire extraordinary was not its existence, but its persistence and its peculiar behaviour, as the bush continued to burn without being consumed, defying the natural laws that governed combustion, while creating a phenomenon that demanded investigation. I will now turn aside and see this great sight. Why the bush does not burn, Moses decided, his curiosity overcoming the caution that 40 years of wilderness experience had taught him to exercise when encountering unexpected phenomena. The decision to investigate the burning bush was more than idle curiosity. It represented the kind of spiritual sensitivity that had been developing within Moses during his years of exile and reflection. The shepherd who had learned to observe carefully the signs that indicated water, predators, or weather changes had also developed awareness of spiritual realities that transcended the purely physical challenges of desert survival. The voice that called to him from within the flames carried authority that transcended any human communication Moses had ever heard, speaking his name with intimate knowledge that revealed the speaker's complete understanding of his identity, his history, and his destiny. Moses, Moses. The repetition of his name emphasized both the urgency of the communication and the personal nature of the relationship being established between the divine caller and the human recipient. Moses' response, "Here I am," reflected both his willingness to respond to the unknown caller and his recognition that he was encountering something that transcended normal human experience. The same phrase that had characterized the responses of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, when God had called them to their respective roles in the unfolding drama of redemption, now marked Moses' entry into that sacred history. The command that followed, "Do not draw near this place. Take your sandals off your feet, for the place where you stand is holy ground," established the sacred character of the encounter while teaching Moses the reverence that would be required for the relationship he was about to enter with the God who had chosen him for purposes beyond his imagination. The identification that the voice provided removed any doubt about the significance of what was occurring. "I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob." This was not an encounter with some local deity or spiritual phenomenon, but rather a meeting with the creator of the universe, who had entered into covenant relationship with the Hebrew patriarchs, and who was now preparing to fulfill the promises he had made to them centuries earlier. Moses' reaction, hiding his face because he was afraid to look upon God, demonstrated both his recognition of the divine presence and his understanding of human limitations when confronted with divine holiness. The fear that characterized his response was not terror of arbitrary power, but reverent acknowledgement of the vast difference between creator and creature, between infinite holiness and finite sinfulness. The revelation that followed would shatter Moses' comfortable assumptions about his future, while revealing the divine purposes that had been operating through every circumstance of his life, from his preservation as an infant through his Egyptian education to his exile in Midian. "I have surely seen the oppression of my people who are in Egypt, and have heard their cry because of their taskmasters, for I know their sorrows." The God who spoke from the burning bush was not a distant deity, unconcerned with human suffering, but rather the covenant-keeping God who had bound himself to the welfare of Abraham's descendants, and who would act to fulfill his promises despite the apparent impossibility of such fulfillment, given the circumstances that currently prevailed in Egypt. "So I have come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians, and to bring them up from that land to a good and large land, to a land flowing with milk and honey, to the place of the Canaanites and the Hittites and the Amorites and the Perizzites and the Hivites and the Jebusites." The deliverance that God announced was not merely rescue from Egyptian oppression, but restoration to the land that he had promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, a land whose fertility and abundance would provide everything necessary for their prosperity and growth as a nation. Yet the most shocking aspect of this divine revelation was not the announcement of Hebrew deliverance, but the identification of the human instrument through whom such deliverance would be accomplished. "Come now, therefore, and I will send you to Pharaoh, that you may bring my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt." The commission that Moses received was both the greatest honor and the most daunting responsibility that had ever been offered to a human being. The shepherd who had fled Egypt as a fugitive was being called to return as God's representative, to confront the most powerful ruler in the ancient world, and to demand the release of a population whose economic value to Egypt was incalculable. Moses' initial response revealed both his humility and his realistic assessment of the challenges involved. Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh, and that I should bring the children of Israel out of Egypt? The question was not merely rhetorical, but reflected genuine bewilderment about how someone in his circumstances could possibly accomplish such an extraordinary mission. The answer that God provided addressed not Moses' qualifications, but rather the divine presence that would accompany and empower him. I will certainly be with you, and this shall be a sign to you that I have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall serve God on this mountain. The promise of divine presence was more significant than any human credential could have been, as it guaranteed that Moses would not face Pharaoh's opposition in his own strength, but would serve as the instrument through whom divine power would be exercised. The sign that was offered, that the Hebrew people would worship God on Mount Horeb after their deliverance, provided confirmation of the ultimate success of the mission, despite the apparent impossibility of its accomplishment. Yet Moses' questions continued, revealing the practical concerns that would need to be addressed if his mission was to have any possibility of success. Indeed, when I come to the children of Israel and say to them, "The God of your fathers has sent me to you," and they say to me, "What is his name? What shall I say to them?" The request for God's name was not merely a matter of identification, but reflected Moses' understanding that authority required proper credentials, and that the Hebrew people, after 4 centuries of Egyptian residence, might need convincing that the God who was calling for their deliverance was indeed the same God who had made promises to their patriarchal ancestors. The answer that God provided would become the most significant theological revelation in human history. I am who I am. The name that was revealed, Yahweh, derived from the Hebrew verb meaning to be, indicated that God's essential nature was existence itself, that he was the self-existent one who depended upon nothing outside himself for his being, and who was the source of all other existence. Thus you shall say to the children of Israel, I am has sent me to you, God continued, establishing the credentials that would identify Moses as the authentic representative of the covenant-keeping God, rather than merely another political aspirant seeking to exploit Hebrew discontent for personal advantage. The elaboration that followed connected this new revelation to the historical relationship that God had maintained with the Hebrew patriarchs. Moreover, God said to Moses, Thus you shall say to the children of Israel, The Lord God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob has sent me to you. This is my name forever, and this is my memorial to all generations. The detailed instructions that God provided for Moses' approach to both the Hebrew elders and Pharaoh revealed divine understanding of the political and religious complexities that would be involved in securing Hebrew liberation. The request for a 3-day journey into the wilderness to sacrifice to the Lord was not deceptive, but rather a test of Egyptian willingness to acknowledge Hebrew religious rights and divine authority over human affairs. The prediction that Pharaoh would initially refuse this request, but I'm sure that the king of Egypt will not let you go, no, not even by a mighty hand, prepared Moses for the resistance he would encounter while promising divine intervention that would ultimately compel Egyptian compliance. So I will stretch out my hand and strike Egypt with all my wonders, which I will do in its midst, and after that he will let you go. The promise that the Hebrew people would not leave Egypt empty-handed, but would receive gifts from their Egyptian neighbours, reflected divine justice that would compensate the former slaves for centuries of unpaid labour, while demonstrating Egyptian recognition of Hebrew worth and divine favour. Yet even these comprehensive assurances failed to overcome Moses' sense of inadequacy for the mission he was being offered. His continued protests, "But suppose they will not believe me or listen to my voice? Suppose they say, 'The Lord has not appeared to you,'" revealed both his realistic assessment of the challenges involved and his human reluctance to accept responsibilities that seemed to exceed his capabilities. The miraculous signs that God provided, the transformation of Moses' staff into a serpent and back again, the temporary transformation of his hand to leprous whiteness, and its restoration to health, served both as evidence of divine power and as demonstrations of the miraculous intervention that would accompany Moses' ministry. The final objection that Moses raised: "O my Lord, I am not eloquent, neither before nor since you have spoken to your servant, but I am slow of speech and slow of tongue," addressed what he perceived as his greatest weakness for a mission that would require persuasive communication with both Hebrew people and Egyptian authorities. God's response to this concern revealed both divine patience with human weakness and divine determination to accomplish his purposes through chosen instruments, regardless of their apparent limitations. Who has made man's mouth? Or who makes the mute, the deaf, the seeing, or the blind? Have not I, the Lord? Now therefore go, and I will be with your mouth and teach you what you shall say. The provision of Aaron as Moses' spokesman demonstrated divine accommodation to human weakness, while ensuring that the mission would proceed despite Moses' continued sense of inadequacy. The reunion of the brothers who had been separated for 40 years would mark the beginning of a partnership that would challenge the greatest empire in the ancient world and establish the foundation for a civilization based upon divine law rather than human ambition. As Moses prepared to return to Egypt and begin the mission that would transform him from fugitive shepherd into the deliverer of a nation, he carried with him not merely divine commission, but divine promise that the impossible would be accomplished through means that would demonstrate God's power to every nation on earth, while vindicating his faithfulness to the covenant he had made with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The journey back to Egypt that Moses undertook with his wife Zipporah and their children was fraught with dangers that extended beyond the physical hazards of desert travel to encompass the spiritual and political challenges that awaited him in the land from which he had fled as a fugitive 4 decades earlier. The man who had once commanded respect as an Egyptian prince now returned as a shepherd whose only credentials were the divine commission he had received at Mount Horeb and the miraculous signs that had been entrusted to his staff. The reunion with Aaron that occurred in the wilderness near Mount Horeb demonstrated the providential timing that would characterize the entire Exodus narrative, as God had simultaneously prepared both brothers for their respective roles in the drama that was about to unfold. The meeting between the shepherd who had been chosen to lead and the priest who would serve as his spokesman marked the beginning of a partnership that would challenge the greatest empire in the ancient world while establishing the foundation for Hebrew civilization. Aaron's immediate acceptance of his brother's account of the divine encounter revealed both his spiritual sensitivity and his recognition that extraordinary times required extraordinary measures. The priest who had remained in Egypt during Moses' exile had witnessed the intensification of Hebrew oppression, while maintaining hope that divine intervention would eventually provide deliverance for his people. The approach to the Hebrew elders that Moses and Aaron made upon their arrival in Egypt followed the strategy that God had outlined at the burning bush, beginning with those who were most likely to recognize divine authority and support the call for liberation. The demonstration of the miraculous signs, the transformation of the staff into a serpent, the temporary transformation of Moses' hand to leprous whiteness, provided evidence of supernatural empowerment that transcended any human capability. The response of the Hebrew people to Moses' message exceeded his most optimistic expectations, as generations of oppression had prepared them to recognize authentic divine intervention when it finally appeared. So the people believed, and when they heard that the Lord had visited the children of Israel and that he had looked on their affliction, then they bowed their heads and worshipped. Yet the initial Hebrew acceptance of Moses' authority was merely the preliminary step in a confrontation that would test the faith of all participants while demonstrating divine power in ways that would transform the religious understanding of the entire ancient world. The real challenge lay in the palace of Pharaoh, where the representatives of the Hebrew God would face the ruler who claimed divine status for himself and whose authority was supported by the most powerful military and administrative apparatus in the known world. The first audience with Pharaoh that Moses and Aaron secured was both diplomatic courtesy and spiritual warfare, as 2 men who claimed to speak for an invisible deity confronted a king whose very identity was based upon his supposed incarnation of Egyptian gods. The request they presented, "Thus says the Lord God of Israel, let my people go that they may hold a feast to me in the wilderness," was carefully crafted to test Egyptian willingness to acknowledge Hebrew religious rites without immediately threatening the economic foundation of Egyptian prosperity. Pharaoh's response revealed both his ignorance of Hebrew religious traditions and his contempt for any authority that challenged his own. Who is the Lord that I should obey his voice to let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, nor will I let Israel go." The dismissal was more than political calculation. It was theological declaration that Egyptian polytheism recognized no deity whose authority transcended pharaonic power. The modification of the Hebrew request to include explicit mention of divine command, "The God of the Hebrews has met with us. Please, let us go 3 days' journey into the desert and sacrifice to the Lord our God, lest he fall upon us with pestilence or with the sword," introduced the element of divine judgment that would become central to the subsequent confrontation, while providing Pharaoh with opportunity to reconsider his position before such judgment was executed. Yet Pharaoh's response to this modified request revealed both his political sophistication and his spiritual blindness, as he interpreted Moses' mission not as authentic divine calling, but as political agitation designed to foment rebellion among workers whose productivity was essential for Egyptian economic prosperity. "Moses and Aaron, why do you take the people from their work? Get back to your labor." The intensification of Hebrew oppression that followed this initial confrontation, the withdrawal of straw for brickmaking while maintaining production quotas that had been established when such materials were provided, demonstrated Pharaoh's strategy for dealing with Hebrew discontent, while revealing the kind of administrative cruelty that characterized Egyptian governance when political control was threatened. The Hebrew foremen who were beaten for failing to meet impossible production standards became unwitting instruments of Pharaoh's psychological warfare against Moses, as their complaints, "Why have you so dealt with your servants? There is no straw given to your servants, and they say to us, 'Make brick.' And indeed your servants are beaten, but the fault is in your own people," placed responsibility for increased suffering upon those who had promised deliverance. The confrontation between these foremen and Moses revealed the political complexity that would characterize the entire liberation process. "Let the Lord look on you and judge, because you have made us abhorrent in the sight of Pharaoh and in the sight of his servants, to put a sword in their hand to kill us." The people who should have been most supportive of divine intervention had become hostile to their deliverers because liberation required temporary intensification of suffering. Moses' anguished prayer in response to this unexpected opposition from his own people revealed both his human compassion and his incomplete understanding of divine strategy. "Lord, why have you brought trouble on this people? Why is it you have sent me? For since I came to Pharaoh to speak in your name, he has done evil to this people. Neither have you delivered your people at all." The divine response to Moses' complaint provided both encouragement and explanation, connecting the immediate crisis to the larger purposes that God was accomplishing through events that appeared to contradict his promises. "Now you shall see what I will do to Pharaoh, for with a strong hand he will let them go, and with a strong hand he will drive them out of his land." The renewal of divine promises that followed reaffirmed God's commitment to covenant faithfulness, while revealing the name that would become central to Hebrew religious identity: "I am the Lord. I appeared to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob as God Almighty, but by my name Lord I was not known to them. I have also established my covenant with them to give them the land of Canaan, the land of their pilgrimage, in which they were strangers." The acknowledgement of Hebrew suffering that God provided demonstrated divine awareness of their condition, while promising intervention that would vindicate both his justice and his faithfulness. "And I have also heard the groaning of the children of Israel whom the Egyptians keep in bondage, and I have remembered my covenant." The comprehensive promise that followed outlined the complete transformation that divine intervention would accomplish. "Therefore say to the children of Israel, I am the Lord. I will bring you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians. I will rescue you from their bondage, and I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and with great judgments. I will take you as my people, and I will be your God. Then you shall know that I am the Lord your God who brings you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians." The promise of territorial inheritance that concluded this divine speech connected immediate deliverance to ultimate destiny. "And I will bring you into the land which I swore to give to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and I will give it to you as a heritage. I am the Lord." Yet even these renewed assurances failed to overcome Hebrew discouragement that had resulted from the intensification of their oppression, but they did not heed Moses because of anguish of spirit and cruel bondage. The people who should have been most encouraged by divine promises had become too broken to believe that such promises could be fulfilled. The commission that Moses received to return to Pharaoh despite Hebrew rejection revealed divine determination to accomplish his purposes regardless of human cooperation or understanding. Go in, speak to Pharaoh, king of Egypt, that he must let the children of Israel go out of his land. Moses' continued reluctance. The children of Israel have not heeded me. How then shall Pharaoh heed me, for I am of uncircumcised lips? Reflected both his realistic assessment of the challenges involved and his incomplete appreciation of the divine power that would be exercised through his words and actions. The genealogical record that was inserted at this point in the narrative served both to establish Moses's and Aaron's credentials as legitimate representatives of Hebrew leadership and to connect their mission to the covenant promises that had been made to their ancestors. The fact that they were descendants of Levi, the tribe that had been set apart for religious service, provided additional validation for their authority to speak on behalf of God and his people. The final preparation for the confrontation with Pharaoh involved detailed instructions about the miraculous signs that would authenticate Moses' authority while demonstrating divine power in ways that would be comprehensible to Egyptian religious and political leadership. The transformation of Aaron's staff into a serpent that would devour the serpents produced by Egyptian magicians would provide symbolic representation of the superiority of Hebrew God over Egyptian deities. Yet God's warning that Pharaoh's heart would be hardened despite these demonstrations of supernatural power prepared Moses for the extended conflict that would be necessary before Egyptian resistance was overcome. But I will harden Pharaoh's heart and multiply my signs and my wonders in the land of Egypt. But Pharaoh will not heed you, so that I may lay my hand on Egypt and bring my armies and my people, the children of Israel, out of the land of Egypt by great judgments. The purpose that would be accomplished through this prolonged confrontation extended beyond Hebrew liberation to encompass divine self-revelation that would impact the entire ancient world. And the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord, when I stretch out my hand on Egypt and bring out the children of Israel from among them. As Moses and Aaron prepared for their final confrontation with Pharaoh, they carried with them not merely hope for Hebrew deliverance, but divine promise that the impossible would be accomplished through means that would demonstrate God's sovereignty over the greatest power in the ancient world, while establishing the foundation for a nation whose existence would serve divine purposes until the end of human history. The war between heaven and earth that erupted in the palaces and fields of Egypt would be fought not with armies and weapons, but with supernatural demonstrations that challenged the fundamental assumptions upon which Egyptian civilization had been built for over a millennium. The plagues that began to devastate the land of the pharaohs were not arbitrary displays of divine power, but rather systematic dismantling of the religious and political structures that supported Egyptian claims to divine authority and absolute rule. The first plague, the transformation of the Nile River and all the waters of Egypt into blood, struck at the very heart of Egyptian religious and economic life, as the river that had been worshipped as a deity and that provided the foundation for Egyptian prosperity became a source of death and revulsion. The sight of the sacred Nile flowing red with blood that killed all the fish and made the water undrinkable represented divine judgment upon the god Hapi, while demonstrating that the Hebrew god possessed power over the forces that Egypt considered most fundamental to their existence. The ability of Egyptian magicians to replicate this miracle through their secret arts provided Pharaoh with justification for dismissing the plague as merely superior magic, rather than authentic divine intervention, though their success in transforming additional water into blood only worsened the crisis that was already devastating the kingdom. The hardening of Pharaoh's heart that followed this first demonstration of divine power revealed both his spiritual blindness and his political calculation that acknowledging Hebrew religious claims would undermine the theological foundations of his own authority. The second plague, the invasion of frogs that emerged from the Nile to cover the land and invade every Egyptian dwelling, represented judgment upon the goddess Heket, while creating conditions that made normal life impossible throughout the kingdom. The presence of frogs in bedrooms, kitchens, and food storage areas transformed these amphibians from symbols of fertility and resurrection into instruments of divine judgment that challenged Egyptian assumptions about the beneficent character of their deities. The partial success of Egyptian magicians in producing additional frogs demonstrated both their supernatural abilities and their complete inability to provide relief from the plague that was devastating their kingdom. Their magic could create problems but could not solve them, revealing the limitations of human attempts to manipulate supernatural forces while highlighting the sovereignty of the god who could both send plagues and remove them at will. Pharaoh's first offer of compromise, "Entreat the Lord that he may take away the frogs from me and from my people, and I will let the people go, that they may sacrifice to the Lord," revealed both his recognition of divine power and his assumption that he could negotiate with the Hebrew god as he would with any other political adversary. The request for Moses to set the time for the plague's removal was designed to test whether the Hebrew leader possessed genuine supernatural authority or was merely exploiting natural phenomena for political advantage. Moses' response: "Accept the honor of saying when I shall intercede for you, for your servants, and for your people, to destroy the frogs from you and your houses, that they may remain in the river only," demonstrated both his confidence in divine power and his willingness to allow Pharaoh to verify that the plague's removal would result from supernatural intervention rather than natural causes. The complete elimination of the frogs at the precise time that Moses had promised provided irrefutable evidence of divine authority, while creating an opportunity for Pharaoh to fulfill his commitment to allow Hebrew worship in the wilderness. Yet when relief came, Pharaoh's heart was hardened once again, as the removal of immediate pressure allowed him to forget the terror that had motivated his promise and to resume his resistance to Hebrew liberation. The third plague, the transformation of dust into gnats that covered both humans and animals throughout Egypt, represented judgment upon the god Geb, while creating conditions that made Egyptian religious rituals impossible to perform. The priests who were required to maintain ritual purity for their temple service found themselves unable to approach their deities, while covered with insects that made them ceremonially unclean, according to their own religious standards. The failure of Egyptian magicians to replicate this plague marked a crucial turning point in the supernatural conflict, as their acknowledgement, "This is the finger of God," represented recognition that Moses was exercising power that transcended human magical abilities. Yet even this admission by his own religious advisors failed to soften Pharaoh's resistance, as political considerations outweighed spiritual evidence in his determination to maintain Egyptian control over Hebrew labour. The fourth plague, the swarms of flies that filled Egyptian homes while leaving the Hebrew settlements in Goshen untouched, introduced the element of divine discrimination that would characterize the remaining plagues while demonstrating God's ability to protect his chosen people, even while judging their oppressors. The clear geographical distinction between Egyptian suffering and Hebrew protection provided evidence that these catastrophes were not natural disasters, but supernatural interventions designed to secure Hebrew liberation. Pharaoh's second offer of compromise, that the Hebrews could sacrifice to their god but must remain within Egyptian territory, revealed his understanding that the real issue was not religious freedom, but political independence. His willingness to accommodate Hebrew worship while maintaining Egyptian control demonstrated sophisticated political thinking that sought to satisfy religious demands without surrendering economic benefits. Moses' rejection of this compromise: "It is not right to do so, for we would be sacrificing the abomination of the Egyptians to the Lord our God. If we sacrifice the abomination of the Egyptians before their eyes, then will they not stone us?" revealed both practical wisdom about Egyptian religious sensitivities and theological understanding that authentic worship required complete separation from the influences that had corrupted Hebrew spiritual life during their residence in Egypt. The fifth plague, a severe pestilence that killed Egyptian livestock while sparing Hebrew animals, represented judgment upon the gods Apis and Hathor, while destroying the agricultural foundation of Egyptian prosperity. The death of cattle, horses, camels, oxen and sheep throughout Egypt created economic devastation that would persist long after the plague had ended, while demonstrating divine power over the forces that sustained human civilization. The sixth plague, boils that afflicted both humans and animals throughout Egypt, represented judgment upon the god Imhotep, while creating physical suffering that affected every level of Egyptian society, from Pharaoh's court to the humblest agricultural workers. The fact that Egyptian magicians were unable to stand before Moses because of the boils that covered their own bodies provided dramatic evidence that human magical arts provided no protection against divine judgment. The seventh plague, hail mixed with fire that destroyed crops and killed both humans and animals in the fields, represented judgment upon the sky god Nut, while demonstrating divine control over weather patterns that Egyptians considered beyond human influence. The advance warning that God provided through Moses allowed those who feared his word to protect their servants and livestock, while those who ignored the warning suffered devastating losses. Pharaoh's third offer of compromise: "I have sinned this time. The Lord is righteous, and my people and I are wicked. Entreat the Lord that there may be no more mighty thunderings and hail, for it is enough. I will let you go, and you shall stay no longer," represented his most complete acknowledgement of divine authority, while revealing the terror that supernatural judgment had created throughout his kingdom. Yet once again, when relief came through Moses' intercession, Pharaoh's heart was hardened, and he withdrew his promise to allow Hebrew departure. The pattern of confession under pressure, followed by renewed resistance when pressure was removed, revealed both the persistence of human rebellion against divine authority and the necessity for even more severe judgments to accomplish divine purposes. The eighth plague, locusts that consumed every remaining plant throughout Egypt, represented judgment upon the god Serapis, while completing the agricultural devastation that had been initiated by the hail. The warning that preceded this plague provided Pharaoh's servants with opportunity to counsel their king about the wisdom of accepting Hebrew demands before additional catastrophes destroyed what remained of Egyptian prosperity. The division within Pharaoh's court that emerged during this crisis, as his servants pleaded, "Do you not yet know that Egypt is destroyed? Let the men go, that they may serve the Lord their God," revealed the growing recognition among Egyptian leadership that continued resistance to Hebrew liberation would result in complete national destruction. Pharaoh's fourth offer of compromise, that Hebrew men could go to worship while their families remained in Egypt as hostages, demonstrated his understanding that family connections would ensure Hebrew return, while revealing his continued refusal to acknowledge the complete independence that divine liberation required. The ninth plague, 3 days of darkness so complete that Egyptians could not see each other, while the Hebrews enjoyed normal light in their dwellings, represented judgment upon the sun god Ra, while demonstrating divine power over the celestial forces that Egyptians considered most reliable and unchanging. The supernatural character of this darkness, which could be felt and which was not relieved by any artificial light source, provided unmistakable evidence of divine intervention. Pharaoh's fifth offer of compromise, that all the Hebrew people could go to worship if they left their livestock in Egypt, revealed his continued attempt to maintain some form of economic control while appearing to grant religious freedom. His assumption that the Hebrews would return for their animals demonstrated political sophistication, while revealing spiritual blindness about the permanent character of the liberation that God was accomplishing. Moses' final warning, that the death of every firstborn throughout Egypt would be the consequence of continued resistance, provided Pharaoh with ultimate opportunity to avoid the judgment that would devastate his kingdom while demonstrating the extent of divine patience that had been extended despite repeated Egyptian violations of promises made under pressure. As the confrontation between divine authority and human rebellion approached its climax, the stage was set for a demonstration of divine power that would not only secure Hebrew liberation, but would also establish the foundation for the religious observances that would preserve the memory of divine deliverance throughout Hebrew history and provide the pattern for redemption that would ultimately encompass all humanity. The final plague that would shatter Egyptian resistance and secure Hebrew liberation required preparation that transcended the immediate crisis to establish institutions and observances that would preserve the memory of divine deliverance for generations yet unborn. The Passover that God instituted through Moses was not merely a protective ritual designed to spare Hebrew firstborn from the judgment that would devastate Egypt, but rather a comprehensive system of worship and remembrance that would become central to Hebrew religious identity throughout their subsequent history. "This month shall be your beginning of months. It shall be the first month of the year to you," God instructed Moses and Aaron, establishing a new calendar that would forever mark the exodus from Egypt as the defining moment in Hebrew national consciousness. The transformation of the Hebrew understanding of time itself reflected the magnitude of the deliverance that was about to be accomplished, while ensuring that future generations would organize their lives around the memory of divine intervention. The selection of a lamb for each household, a lamb for a household, required careful attention to the animal's qualifications, while emphasizing the family solidarity that would be essential for Hebrew survival during the trials that lay ahead. The requirement that the lamb be without blemish, a male of the first year, established standards of perfection that would later be incorporated into the sacrificial system that governed Hebrew worship throughout their national existence. The communal sharing that was required when households were too small to consume an entire lamb demonstrated the interdependence that would characterize Hebrew society, while ensuring that no family would face the coming judgment without the protection that divine provision offered. The careful calculation of portions, according to the number of the persons, according to each man's need you shall make your count for the lamb, reflected both practical wisdom and spiritual principle that divine blessings were meant to be shared rather than hoarded. The timing of the sacrifice, the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel shall kill it at twilight, created a simultaneous nationwide observance that would unite Hebrew families throughout Egypt in common preparation for the deliverance that God had promised. The synchronization of this ritual across the entire Hebrew population demonstrated both organizational capability and spiritual unity that had been developing throughout the months of confrontation with Egyptian authority. The application of blood to the doorposts and lintels of Hebrew homes served both as protection from the destroying angel and as public declaration of faith in divine promises, despite the apparent impossibility of escape from Egyptian bondage. "And when I see the blood, I will pass over you, and the plague shall not be on you to destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt," God promised, establishing the principle that divine judgment could be averted through obedient faith in divine provision. The roasting of the lamb, roasted in fire with unleavened bread and with bitter herbs they shall eat it, provided both practical nutrition for the journey ahead and symbolic representation of the haste and hardship that would characterize Hebrew departure from Egypt. The prohibition against eating the meat raw or boiled in water emphasized the distinctiveness of this meal while ensuring proper preparation that would prevent illness during the critical period that followed. The requirement to eat the Passover meal with a belt on your waist, your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand demonstrated the immediacy of the departure that would follow the final plague while emphasizing the readiness that faith required when divine deliverance finally arrived. The instruction to eat it in haste reflected both the urgency of the situation and the trust that God's timing would be perfect despite human inability to predict exactly when liberation would occur. The complete consumption of the lamb, "You shall let none of it remain until morning, and what remains of it until morning you shall burn with fire," prevented any portion of the sacrifice from being treated as common food, while emphasizing the sacred character of the entire observance. The requirement to destroy any leftover portions ensured that the Passover would be remembered as a complete offering rather than merely another meal. The institution of the Feast of Unleavened Bread that would follow the Passover created an extended period of remembrance that would annually renew Hebrew commitment to the lessons learned through their Egyptian experience. 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread. On the first day you shall remove leaven from your houses, for whoever eats leavened bread from the first day until the 7th day, that person shall be cut off from Israel. The prohibition against leaven during this festival period served both practical and symbolic purposes, as the haste of departure would not allow time for bread to rise, while the absence of leaven represented the moral purification that divine deliverance required. The severity of the penalty for violating this prohibition, exclusion from the Hebrew community, demonstrated the seriousness with which God regarded obedience to the institutions he was establishing. The educational component that was built into the Passover observance ensured that future generations would understand both the historical circumstances that had necessitated divine intervention and the spiritual principles that such intervention had demonstrated. "And it shall be, when your children say to you, 'What do you mean by this service?' that you shall say, 'It is the Passover sacrifice of the Lord who passed over the houses of the children of Israel in Egypt when he struck the Egyptians and delivered our households.'" The Hebrew response to these detailed instructions, "Then the people bowed their heads and worshipped," demonstrated both their recognition of divine authority and their gratitude for the protection that was being provided despite their previous complaints about the hardships that Moses' mission had brought upon them. The transformation from bitter criticism to reverent worship reflected the spiritual maturation that had occurred through their experience of divine intervention on their behalf. The careful execution of the Passover instructions throughout Hebrew settlements in Egypt created the largest coordinated religious observance in human history to that point, while demonstrating organizational capabilities that would prove essential for the journey through the wilderness that lay ahead. The sight of blood on Hebrew doorposts throughout the land served as public testimony to their faith in divine promises, while marking them for divine protection during the judgment that would fall upon their oppressors. The onset of the final plague at midnight on the 14th day of Nisan created devastation throughout Egypt that exceeded all previous demonstrations of divine power in both scope and severity. And it came to pass at midnight that the Lord struck all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sat on his throne to the firstborn of the captive who was in the dungeon, and all the firstborn of livestock. The death of Pharaoh's own son represented both personal tragedy for the royal family and political catastrophe for the Egyptian dynasty, as the heir apparent who should have continued pharaonic rule had become a victim of the divine judgment that his father's stubbornness had precipitated. The democratic character of the plague, affecting rich and poor, free and slave, human and animal, demonstrated that divine justice transcended all earthly distinctions while revealing the universal consequences of rebellion against divine authority. The wailing that arose throughout Egypt, so Pharaoh rose in the night, he, all his servants and all the Egyptians, and there was a great cry in Egypt, for there was not a house where there was not one dead, provided acoustic evidence of the plague's comprehensiveness, while creating an atmosphere of terror that finally broke Egyptian resistance to Hebrew liberation. Pharaoh's capitulation came not through gradual negotiation, but through complete surrender that acknowledged both divine power and Hebrew independence. "Rise, go out from among my people, both you and the children of Israel, and go serve the Lord as you have said. Also take your flocks and your herds, as you have said, and be gone, and bless me also." The request for blessing that concluded Pharaoh's surrender demonstrated his recognition that the Hebrew God possessed power to curse or bless according to his will, and that Egyptian welfare now depended upon Hebrew goodwill rather than Egyptian control. The transformation from oppressor demanding service to supplicant requesting favour captured perfectly the reversal that divine intervention had accomplished. The Egyptian generosity that accompanied Hebrew departure, and the Lord had given the people favour in the sight of the Egyptians, so that they granted them what they requested. Thus they plundered the Egyptians, represented both divine justice that compensated Hebrew labour with Egyptian wealth, and practical provision that would sustain the Hebrew people during their journey to the land that God had promised to their ancestors. The magnitude of the Hebrew exodus, about 600,000 men on foot besides children, represented a population movement that would have totaled between 2 and 3 million people when women and children were included, making this the largest migration in human history, while demonstrating the fulfillment of divine promises about Hebrew multiplication that had been given to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The mixed multitude that joined the Hebrew exodus, Egyptians and other foreigners who had been convinced by the plagues that the Hebrew God possessed power superior to any other deity, demonstrated the universal appeal of divine truth while creating challenges that would persist throughout Hebrew history as they struggled to maintain their distinctive identity among peoples with different religious and cultural traditions. The duration of Hebrew residence in Egypt. Now the sojourn of the children of Israel who lived in Egypt was 430 years, had fulfilled precisely the prophecy that God had given to Abraham regarding the bondage and liberation of his descendants, demonstrating divine faithfulness to covenant promises, despite circumstances that had made such fulfillment appear impossible. The haste of Hebrew departure. And they baked unleavened cakes of the dough which they had brought out of Egypt. For it was not leavened, because they were driven out of Egypt and could not wait, nor had they prepared provisions for themselves, captured the urgency that had characterized their liberation, while creating the circumstances that would make unleavened bread a permanent memorial of divine deliverance. As the Hebrew people began their journey from slavery to freedom, they carried with them not merely liberation from Egyptian oppression, but divine promises regarding their destination and destiny that would sustain them through the challenges that lay ahead in the wilderness and beyond. The God who had demonstrated his power to humble the greatest empire in the ancient world had also revealed his faithfulness to covenant relationships that transcended human understanding and his ability to accomplish purposes that exceeded human imagination. The 40 years that followed the exodus from Egypt would transform Moses from the deliverer of a nation into the lawgiver whose statutes would govern human civilization for millennia to come. Yet they would also reveal the human limitations that prevented even the greatest leader in history from entering the promised land he had sacrificed everything to reach. The wilderness wandering that began as a direct journey to Canaan became instead an extended period of national formation during which a collection of tribes with shared ancestry became a people united by divine law and common purpose. The miraculous crossing of the Red Sea that occurred when Pharaoh's pursuing army threatened to recapture the fleeing Hebrews provided the most spectacular demonstration of divine power in human history, while establishing the pattern of supernatural intervention that would characterize Hebrew experience throughout their wilderness journey. The sight of water standing as a wall to them on their right hand and on their left, as the Hebrew people walked across on dry ground, challenged every assumption about natural law, while providing irrefutable evidence that their God possessed authority over forces that no human power could control. The destruction of Pharaoh's army when the waters returned to their normal course eliminated the Egyptian threat while demonstrating that divine protection of his chosen people was absolute and irrevocable. The song of triumph that Moses and the Hebrew people sang on the far shore of the Red Sea, "The Lord is my strength and song, and he has become my salvation. He is my God, and I will praise him," established worship as the proper response to divine deliverance, while providing the theological framework that would govern Hebrew understanding of their relationship with God. Yet the euphoria of miraculous deliverance was quickly followed by the practical challenges of sustaining millions of people in a wilderness environment where water and food were scarce, and where survival depended upon divine provision rather than human planning. The complaints that arose when water was bitter at Marah and when food supplies were exhausted in the wilderness of sin revealed both the persistence of human anxiety, despite divine promises, and the patience that God demonstrated in providing for needs, even when such provision was demanded through grumbling rather than requested through faith. The manna that God provided daily throughout the wilderness journey served both as practical nutrition and as spiritual instruction about dependence upon divine provision rather than human accumulation. The requirement that each family gather only enough for their daily needs, with the exception of the double portion provided before the Sabbath, taught lessons about trust and contentment that challenged the materialistic values that Hebrew residents in Egypt had encouraged. The water that flowed from the rock at Rephidim when Moses struck it with his staff demonstrated divine ability to provide life-sustaining resources in the most unlikely circumstances while establishing Moses' authority as God's representative, whose actions could command supernatural response. Yet this same miracle would later become the occasion for Moses' greatest failure, when his anger led him to strike the rock in disobedience to divine instruction, resulting in his exclusion from the Promised Land despite his faithful service throughout the wilderness period. The victory over the Amalekites that was secured when Moses held up his hands during the battle established the principle that Hebrew success in warfare depended upon divine blessing rather than military superiority, while demonstrating the importance of intercessory prayer in securing divine intervention. The assistance that Aaron and Hur provided when Moses' arms grew weary revealed the collaborative nature of spiritual leadership while foreshadowing the institutional structures that would support Hebrew religious life in the Promised Land. The arrival at Mount Sinai marked the beginning of the most significant period in Hebrew history, as the mountain where Moses had first encountered God in the burning bush became the site where divine law was revealed, and the covenant relationship between God and his chosen people was formalized through ceremonies that established the foundation for Hebrew civilization. The theophany that accompanied the giving of the law, with thunder, lightning, thick cloud, and the sound of a trumpet, demonstrated the holiness and majesty of the God who was establishing his authority over human affairs. The 10 Commandments that God spoke directly to the Hebrew people provided the fundamental principles that would govern both their relationship with him and their relationships with one another, establishing moral standards that would influence human civilization for thousands of years. The additional laws that God revealed to Moses during his 40 days on the mountain addressed every aspect of Hebrew life from worship and justice to agriculture and social relationships, creating a comprehensive legal system that recognized divine authority as the source of all legitimate human law. The golden calf incident that occurred while Moses was receiving divine law on Mount Sinai revealed both the persistence of idolatrous tendencies among people who had been raised in Egyptian polytheism and the devastating consequences of abandoning divine truth in favor of religious practices that appealed to human preferences rather than divine commands. The intercession that Moses made on behalf of the people who had violated their covenant obligations demonstrated both his love for those he led and his understanding that divine mercy was essential for human survival, despite human unfaithfulness. The breaking of the stone tablets that contain the Ten Commandments, when Moses witnessed Hebrew worship of the golden calf, provided dramatic representation of the broken covenant relationship, while establishing the principle that divine law could not coexist with idolatrous practices. The grinding of the golden calf into powder and the requirement that the Hebrew people drink it mixed with water provided both symbolic and practical demonstration that false worship was ultimately destructive to those who practiced it. The second giving of the law that followed Moses' successful intercession for divine forgiveness restored the covenant relationship while revealing divine character in the proclamation, the Lord God, merciful and gracious, long-suffering and abounding in goodness and truth, keeping mercy for thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin, by no means clearing the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children and the children's children to the third and the fourth generation. The construction of the tabernacle according to the detailed specifications that God had provided created a portable sanctuary that would enable Hebrew worship throughout their wilderness journey, while establishing the sacrificial system that would govern their approach to divine holiness. The careful attention to materials, measurements, and procedures reflected divine perfection, while teaching the Hebrew people that worship required obedience to divine standards rather than accommodation to human preferences. The rebellion at Kadesh Barnea, when the Hebrew people refused to enter the Promised Land because of their fear of the inhabitants whom the spies had reported, represented the crucial failure that extended their wilderness journey from months to decades, while demonstrating that divine promises required human faith and obedience for their fulfillment. The judgment that condemned an entire generation to die in the wilderness, while their children inherited the promises that their parents had forfeited, revealed both divine justice and divine patience in dealing with human failure. The additional rebellions that occurred throughout the wilderness period, including Korah's challenge to Moses' authority, the people's complaints about manna, and their demand for meat, revealed the persistence of human dissatisfaction despite divine provision, while testing Moses' leadership abilities and deepening his understanding of the challenges involved in governing a people whose relationship with God was still being established. The bronze serpent that Moses erected when venomous snakes afflicted the Hebrew camp provided both immediate healing for those who looked upon it in faith and prophetic symbol of the salvation that would eventually be provided through divine sacrifice. The requirement that healing came through, looking rather than through elaborate ritual or expensive offering, demonstrated that divine grace was available to all who would receive it through simple obedience to divine instruction. The final failure that excluded Moses himself from entering the Promised Land occurred when his anger at continued Hebrew complaints led him to strike the rock twice, instead of speaking to it as God had commanded, resulting in divine judgment that demonstrated that even the greatest leaders were subject to divine standards, and that proximity to divine power did not provide exemption from divine justice. The view of the Promised Land that God provided to Moses from the top of Mount Nebo before his death offered both reward for faithful service and reminder that human leadership was temporary, while divine purposes were eternal. The sight of the land that he had sacrificed everything to reach, but would never personally possess, captured the poignancy of human limitation, while affirming that his life's work had accomplished the purposes for which God had called him from the burning bush. The death of Moses at age 120, when his eyes were not dim nor his natural vigour diminished, marked the end of an era in Hebrew history while establishing a standard for leadership that would never be equalled. The mourning that lasted 30 days reflected Hebrew recognition of their loss, while the continuation of their journey under Joshua's leadership demonstrated that divine purposes transcended any individual leader's contribution. The legacy that Moses left to the Hebrew people and to human civilization included not merely liberation from Egyptian bondage, but the revelation of divine law that would govern human conduct throughout subsequent history. The principle that legitimate authority derives from divine rather than human sources, the concept that justice must be based upon transcendent standards rather than human preferences, and the understanding that individual worth derives from divine creation rather than social status, all would influence the development of human civilization in ways that the fugitive shepherd who encountered God at the burning bush could never have imagined. The transformation of Moses from Egyptian prince to Hebrew deliverer to divine lawgiver demonstrated both human potential when surrendered to divine purposes and human limitation when measured against divine standards. The man who had been chosen to lead God's people from slavery to freedom had learned through 40 years in the wilderness that the greatest achievement any human being could attain was faithful service to purposes that transcended personal ambition and endured beyond personal existence. The story of Moses would inspire leaders throughout subsequent history while reminding them that greatness was measured not by earthly achievement but by faithfulness to divine calling, and that the most significant contributions to human welfare often required sacrifices that exceeded personal benefit. The fugitive who had become a deliverer had demonstrated that God could use anyone willing to surrender personal preferences for divine purposes, and that the most unlikely individuals could become instruments of changes that transformed the world. In the end, Moses' greatest legacy was not the liberation he had secured or the laws he had received, but the demonstration that human beings could indeed serve divine purposes despite their limitations, and that obedience to divine truth was both possible and necessary for the establishment of justice and righteousness in human affairs. The shepherd's staff that had become the rod of God remained a symbol that divine power was available to transform human weakness into strength sufficient for whatever challenges divine calling might require.